So, continuing the retrospective reviews, we have something a little more recent today. However, it's still one of the better horror movies to have come out in the last 10 years, in my eyes. And on the lead up to Halloween, I thought it relevant to discuss and pass on my thoughts. Sinister, a movie that takes the concept of the boogeyman and flips it on its head. Overall, it's a dark, intense, atmospheric horror that builds to an ending that may or may not satisfy viewers. Though in my eyes, it's an ending that is fitting to the film and tone set. Though it is a product of the time the movie came out, a lot of third acts of horror films were fairly similar in impact. The film opens in a way that sets the tone perfectly. Super 8 footage of a family of 4, noosed, heads in sacks, attached to a tree. The unseen mastermind behind this then pulls a rope and a tree branch comes loose, causing the family to be hung. It's a brutal opener, chilling, and leaves you questioning who did this. The movie continues with the family moving into the very same house that this murder took place in. A true crime writer who was searching for his next bestseller thought it would be a good idea for musings, though didn't inform his wife they were actually living in the scene of the murder. Obviously this is some mild plot devices for arguments and world building, but it isn't overly ham-fisted like some horror movies tend to do. And overall it passes off in a fairly reasonable way that isn't too jarring when trying to enjoy it as a whole. It does engage you and leads to some interesting scenes. The Super 8 footage becomes the main focus of the movie. The scene we initially open with is part of many murders, recorded and structured in a similar way. We find this out because our writer, Ellison, discovers a box in the attic with a projector and several other rolls of film, all labelled as home movies with eerie titles, play on words of the events themselves. Again, this falls under one of the many tropes that horror movies have done already, though Sinister did it in a way which was fairly brutal, even for a horror movie. A lot of these types of films will reveal the villain from the outset, or at least tease it, whereas Sinister kept the mastermind behind the murders a secret, only teasing the potential for supernatural happenings here and there, which eventually grows when a symbol is seen in one of the films and is linked to the deity known as Bughuul, which in folklore supposedly murdered entire families, taking one of the children to feed off their souls as a form of sustenance. So a great way to introduce the occult and supernatural potential behind the murders, which then opens up a great scene where Ellison eventually hears the projector film in the attic. Heading up there, naturally he sees the missing children sat there watching one of the gruesome home movies. The figure of Bughuul then comes into view before materializing. This is much how the movie progresses. The way Bughuul is teased though, and how he comes into view and interacts with Ellison is incredibly well done. Subtle movements, turns of the head on film, appearing and then suddenly walking out. It isn't those mindless jump scares we've seen before, or at least that isn't how I viewed it anyway. The figure of Bughuul is shrouded. You can't completely make out how he looks and what his distinctive features are. So even though we see him briefly here and there, we never see him fully, which for me is the best kind of jump scare. There is still something hidden and yet to be revealed. Eventually we learn from the home movies that it was in fact the missing children who had conducted the murders, and then left with Bughuul under his influence, which culminates ultimately in Ellison's family being murdered, including him, his daughter being the culprit and then heading off with Bughuul. Sinister is one of those movies that managed to do a lot with so little. It had a production budget of just $3 million, an incredibly small amount by today's standards, and grossed over $77 million at the box office, which goes to show just how much profit can be had from a well-made movie despite budgetary restrictions. With Sinister, it's a movie that I feel actually benefited from such a small budget. The constraints of that likely added to what could be shown and how much effects could be utilised, ensuring more camera tricks and the less is more approach were used. Its critical response wasn't the best, but horror movies are never incredibly well received. Film.com perhaps gave it the best review, stating it was a deeply frightening horror film that takes its obligation to alarm very seriously. E had the right train of thought and something I personally share, claiming it was the best horror movie of 2012, using the soundtrack as an example and its subversion of horror tropes. A lot of people have compared Sinister to Insidious, which is something I would say is an incredibly unfair comparison. Yes, they are in the same genre of film, however they are chalk and cheese. You have Insidious, very much homage to horror movies gone by, and then you have Sinister, a visceral, brutal guessing game of occult or human murder. Insidious also shows you its supernatural element from the outset. Nearly anyway. Whereas Sinister, again, plays on paranoia and guesswork. To compare the two is quite simply wrong. It's like comparing Insidious to Hellraiser. It just doesn't make sense. Overall, it's a movie that has my respect and took my money when it came out. It sealed itself a sequel as well, which was surprisingly good. If you like horror movies, then Sinister has some genuinely tense and uncomfortable moments. The on-screen deaths are done in a unique and surprisingly aesthetically pleasing way when compared to others. It had great direction and came together in a way that would please most horror fans. Could it have been better? Sure. But it's one of those movies that doesn't reveal too much, engages you into the universe, and keeps you guessing up to a point. Once that point is reached, it knows it, and it just goes full force into the occult and supernatural elements. It's another to put on the watch list this Halloween, if you haven't already. But if you have seen Sinister, what did you make of it? Does your opinion match up with mine at all? I wouldn't say it's one of my favourite horror movies of all time, no. But I would say it's a movie I remember as a great watch and something that does genuinely have rewatch value, which in this day and age is quite rare. As always though guys, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, so please let me know down below in the comment section. And if you did enjoy this video, then please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel for more reviews in the future. If you think this video is worth it and you want to support me, the channel and what I do, then head on over to my Patreon page, the link is in the description box. I've been Mr. H, and until next time, I'll catch you in the comment section.